anyway, but now we will shift gears now and kind of go back to Kant, because the person we talk about today, Schopenhauer, actually he is older than Marx. He is just a little bit younger than Hegel. And he takes us in a different direction than Hegel. Remember that Marx, closely related to Hegel, followed Hegel. Schopenhauer is very interesting philosopher, but he actually hated Hegel with a passion, and he was introduced somewhat of a different way. However, he also starts with Kant, and just like Hegel, overall was impressed by Kant and followed up from his philosophy. So did Schopenhauer, but then with a twist. So let's remember now Kant. What did Kant try to do? What was the noumena and phenomena in Kant?
Phenomena was the world that appeared to us, and then noumena was the object in itself, so without being in any category.
Yeah, exactly. So the Kant's point is kind of like this. This is a simplification, but for our purposes it works, and it will help us to understand Schopenhauer. Our mind, which is probably inside our head, Kant is not trying to say that there is no head, sees the object or whatever, hears the object, feels the object in a certain way and has some concept of an object. So whatever object it is, we say an object, but it really can be anything, including table in this room, right? How do I know there's a table? How do I know what it looks like? Well, my eyes tell me that there is certain light being emitted and it has a certain shape and color. And then if I touch it, my hands will tell me also that there is a certain feel to it. And if I knock on it, there's a sound which my ears can hear. So this kind of comes from the object. But remember what Kant said is that that's not as simple as that, because our mind kind of uses certain categories in order to, you may say, grasp the object. You cannot just grasp it without employing certain categories. So first of all, we are using it within space and time. And he's saying space and time are just the conditions of any experience. So that's kind of like part of our mental software, not part of the objects themselves. Then causality. The objects are all connected through causality. Why is this toilet table here? Well, they must have brought it at some point, right? Why is it even a table? Well, they made it. So there is always this why, which always have an answer. But that is causality. And this is again part of the world as we perceive it, and Kant is saying that this is actually part of our mind. This is how our mind works, not the real world. What about the real world? Well, he's saying we actually don't know very much about this world, but we can just assume certain things, and this is where his thing in itself comes in. He's saying thing in itself would be the very same object, except without application of all this, you may say, distorting things which our mind employs. And this is where he placed them: God, freedom. Because in this world, in phenomenal world, everything is determined. We don't have any freedom here. It seems like every action has a cost. But in this world, he's saying there is freedom, because it is outside space, time, and causality, so freedom there is possible. And your true self, the ego, that also is here, and that is something we all kind of understand. Okay, so the thing in itself, that's this same object. That is exactly the same object, right? I draw the two of them, but it's just that this one is the one we perceive using our categories of understanding and intuitions, and this one is just the way it is by itself, like if there were no people at all to perceive it. Because Kant's saying there are still objects, they are real. He is not saying they are phantom of our imagination, but it's just that we can't know them by themselves the way they really are. Okay, so now Arthur Schopenhauer. Arthur Schopenhauer, like I said, he is younger than Hegel. Hegel was born in 1770, Schopenhauer 1788, so he's 18 years younger, but not that much younger. For the most part, they overlap. Hegel died 1831, and at that point, Schopenhauer was already over 40 years old, so obviously he knew Hegel. Very different life story now. Remember, Hegel actually came from a fairly poor family, and he got an improper education because he pretended to become a priest, and once he actually finished his education, he said, they had so many priests already, so he got a dispensation, and they said, okay, we don't need another priest, so fine. The government paid for his education, but he was able to get away with it. Schopenhauer came from a very affluent but rather dysfunctional family. His father was very, very rich, but his father committed suicide when Schopenhauer himself was a teenager. And his mother, she actually was this extravagant woman who also was a writer. She was writing stories which were very popular, and she was like the soul of the society in Jena. So as a child, he traveled a lot. They lived in England for many years. He fluently spoke English as well as German. They lived in Paris for a few years. He was very, very well educated, very smart kid. His father wanted him to become a merchant, just like himself. Well, for a while, even after his father's death, he thought, okay, since it was his wish, he went to university. He also wanted to study business. But then he hated it so much that eventually he was like, okay, you know what? I'm actually not going to do it. I like philosophy. And he was fortunate enough to have so much money that he really did not need a job at all. So he went into philosophy, classical studies. But like I said, after his father committed suicide when he was a teenager, but he only was able to get control of the money when he was 21 years old. But at that point, he was completely free to do whatever he wanted. He did try to pursue academia, and that's actually kind of an interesting story about this too. Because remember, Hegel was at the Berlin University. And I told you, Hegel was enormously popular with the students. Schopenhauer hated Hegel with a passion. He thought Hegel was just he pretends, he doesn't understand philosophy. And when he came to Berlin, he requested to give lectures. And they allowed him. They said, okay, if you want to lecture to students, no problem. But there was like this kind of unwritten rule that professors do not schedule lectures at the same time. Why not? Because you're still students from each other, right? If you have two professors of philosophy given exactly lecture on philosophy at exactly the same time, obviously students will have to pick one. So why not have them on different days or something? Then they can go to both of you. Well, Schopenhauer decided to do it at the exact same time as Hegel. He thought it was a good idea to stick it to Hegel. Guess what happened? Nobody came. Empty room. Everybody loved Hegel. Nobody even knew Schopenhauer. So he got so mad that he was like, okay, you know what? I'm not going to do it anymore at all. I resign. I don't want to do it. I have enough money. So since then, he literally did nothing other than philosophy. He was writing philosophy books, but he had no job. He was just living his life, traveling, doing whatever he wanted. Again, fortunately enough, having this ton of money. For a while, he lived next to his mother, but he hated the fact that she was trying to control him and so on, all sorts of issues with her. So anyway, for many years, he was pretty much unknown. And that's an interesting thing, because remember, Hegel was already famous during his lifetime. After he died, but Schopenhauer only became famous and actually very prominent few years before he died. And he lived much longer than Hegel. So he died in 1860, at which point he was 72 years old. In fact, he is like, I think, the first philosopher we're talking about who actually had his photograph taken, because they already invented photography in the 1850s. If you want to Google, he is like, has this crazy hair, and there's this famous picture of him already in his late 60s. Anyway, but yeah, he finally had his day. And it's kind of interesting because, you know, for somebody, his entire life, he believed his philosophy is amazing, but nobody recognized him. And he was just writing these books and publishing it at his own expense. And it was funny because, remember, his mother was also writing stories, and there are letters they were exchanging, and she was like making fun of him basically because her stories were actually popular. And he was like, okay, you know what? 100 years from now, everybody will know my books, but nobody will know who you are. And that actually is exactly how it happened, because today we talk about Schopenhauer and the books of his mother, who even cares? She wrote some romantic stories or something, so anyway. Okay, now let's look at his philosophy. So the most important work, which is, hopefully you guys did the reading, because it is very interesting and explains his philosophy pretty well, is from The World as Will and Representation. That is his masterpiece. Prior to that, he also wrote his thesis when he got his doctorate on the fourfold root of the principle of sufficient reason, which is kind of a prequel to the main work. It lays out some of the ground ideas, but it doesn't go into it yet. And then The World as Will and Representation, first edition was 1818. This is shortly before he tried to lecture at the University of Berlin. Like I said, for many years nobody knew about it. He got second edition 1844. At that point still nobody knew about it. And he became famous in the 1850s, about 10 years later. At that point, Hegel kind of started to fade a little bit, although he never completely became irrelevant, but nonetheless, there were people who had problems with Hegel. So what's going on there? The world as will and representation. He goes back to the Kant's model. He's saying, well, that this division overall is correct. There is a thing in itself, of course, and there is a phenomenal world. He agrees with that. He generally agrees with Kant about 90%. But he thinks that Kant is not making much sense when he just separates the thing in itself like this. It seems like it, in a way, causes our sensation. Now that, he says, cannot be. Thing in itself cannot cause our sensation. In fact, this whole division, right, between an object and the mind, the object and the subject, you can say this is subject, is fine. But, well, that was within the reading. So let me see. Do you have questions about that? Oh, one of the other things which the book starts with is this quote. Let me just read it, because the quote itself is fairly striking. He says, "Life and dreams are pages of one and the same book. In real life, we read the pages in coherent order. But when the hour appointed for reading, meaning day, is done, and the time for rest has come, then we often leaf idly through the book, turning now to this page and now to another, in no particular order or sequence." So what is he trying to say? Life is a dream, right? There's no difference between the dream you dream when you are sleeping and the life. The only difference is when you are not dreaming, you're going through pages one by one from beginning to end. But when you dream, what happens? This random stuff, which is also part of your life, is kind of mixed up. Like you can, for example, suddenly see yourself in a place where you were years ago. You can remember conversations which already happened, or even maybe something which didn't happen yet. So it just goes out of order. But the point here is that there is no difference. Life is a dream. Life is representation. This whole idea of representation, phenomena, he calls it representation. The mind is a subject. So remember, according to Kant, there's kind of like two-way relation between them. Now, let's leave alone the thing in itself for now, because he actually has a different idea about the thing in itself and about the whole layout. So he says that within this world of representation, this is the world of representation. Everything is governed by this principle of sufficient reason, PSI. Everything neatly and nicely answers the question why. So everything has a reason. Nothing happens for no reason whatsoever. But that's not the entire story, right? This specific principle of sufficient reason, he says, has four different, what he calls roots, or grounds. One of them is the ground of being, which is the space and time. He agrees with Kant in the sense, what? All representations should appear in space and time. This is the ground of being. The second one, the ground of becoming, is the law of causality. Again, everything is causally connected. That is a slightly different thing to him, but nonetheless, we see that in this world everything is causally connected. Then there is the ground of knowing, which applies to ideas. And this is logic, right? Logic, he's saying, doesn't really tell us much about this too. It's a world on its own. But within logic, again, everything is connected because certain logical propositions prove other propositions. Then there is the fourth root, which is ground of acting, and this is what ethics deals with, and this is why we decide to do certain things, which is not the same thing as causality, but it has some motives which we have behind what we do. Right? Human beings have motives. Motives don't cause things the same way as the accumulation of humidity causes rain. But nonetheless, they influence us and we do certain things. Okay, so this is kind of a slightly technical thing. That's his doctoral thesis before he started talking about the world as will and representation. That kind of lays ground to it. So everything in the world answers the question why. The validity of the principle of sufficient reason is so much involved in a form of consciousness that we simply cannot imagine anything objectively of which why could be further demanded. But does that stop anywhere? Is there something which has no why? So let's talk about the reading now, because I hope you guys did it. What exactly is he looking for there? He starts by actually asking these questions. He basically questions, well, that's the question. He questions whether everything really has answer to this why. It seems like so many things do. And it seems like science provides these answers, right? Because science basically goes into this, studies things, but he says science does two things. One thing science does is actually kind of gives us list of stuff, like the different animals, types of different animals, types of different rocks, and so on. But it also tries to figure out what is causing what. However, he says it doesn't actually answer the most important question, which is what kind of is the reason for the whole thing. And he gives there an interesting example of that. I don't know if anybody can give me this example, I'll give you extra credit. What does he talk about? He's comparing it to you being in some sort of a gathering of people. Right? Imagine you are at a party or something. And he says, well, and people introduce each other to you and say, well, this is my cousin, and this is my brother-in-law, and so on. But he's saying, you keep on questioning asking yourself one question: how do I relate to all these people? So that's the idea, right? In the world, it seems like everything is related, but the most important question is actually not answered. Like, what is the reason for all that? What exactly is happening here? What's behind the subject and the object? And then he says we actually have a way to approach things. We are not just on the outside, because frequently when we think about this, we take a look from the outside, like we're not part of the picture. But we are part of the picture, aren't we? We're not just looking at the world. We are ourselves part of the world. So he says that's where the answer actually is. And two aspects of the body he talks about, that's exactly, one aspect is representation. What's the other one? What's the name of the book? So what's the other one?
The world at will.
The will. Not just the word, but the will. Okay. The will. That's the other aspect. And what's the kernel, the essence of the whole? The will is the kernel and the essence of the whole. Okay, so fine. Let's now just, I guess you didn't do the reading, so let's just look at it. Why is it so important and interesting? So yeah, that is the ultimate ground of everything. And he's saying we have a unique access to the whole thing. Because when you observed all these forces of nature, you don't know exactly what's causing them, right? Like we know there's gravity. How do we know there's gravity? Well, because we periodically dropped objects and they are falling down. But what is driving that? Why is there gravity? Well, we have no idea, right? Even science doesn't tell us exactly what are these forces of nature. But what we do, we kind of have a direct access to that, right? Because we're moving our body. And we know exactly how it happens, don't we? Like if you want to move your hand, what exactly do you do? Well, it's hard to say, but you're doing something and your hand is moving. So he thinks that basically he places the will, which is to him, well, it's a question whether it's thing itself, but we can say it is practically the same thing as the thing in itself here. Why? Because it operates through us. We can feel it. And that's why he calls it the will, because for us it is the will. What is driving you? Well, something is driving you, isn't it? And that, he says, is the thing in itself, our will. So while the world on one hand is representation, on the other hand, the same world is the will. And he says it's not just human beings. Literally everything, all these forces, every object is part of the will. The will is the true thing in itself. So that is the idea. Our body is just the point where the thing in itself and the world kind of interact. They become one. Because unlike the other objects, we don't have any access to them, but we have access to our body. And that is absolutely unique because in that way we can kind of learn what is happening by looking inside ourselves. And what are we going to find there? We're going to find, we go behind the curtain and kind of find this true reality, the will. Okay, so let's just look at it from this point of view. Let me ask you this question. So first of all, why did you decide to take this course? Okay, because it was a requirement. Everybody just for this reason, any other reason? Someone just wanted to know more about philosophy, no? Yeah. Okay, great. Now let's ask the other question. Why did you decide to go to college? Because especially for those of you for whom it's requirement, it's not requirement because they grab you on the street and say, hey, you have to take philosophy. It's because it's part of the college curriculum, right? Part of your major. So why did you decide to go to college? Okay, but the most important final question we can ask, why are you what you are? Do you have answer for this?
Because of the choices I've made.
No, but in a deeper sense, like why are you not the table? Or why are you not man for this matter? Why are you a girl? Why were you born in this particular family on this particular day? Any answer to? But that's the most important question, actually, isn't it? Because everything else starts from this. First, you are born on this planet as this particular individual, be it a boy or a girl or whatever. Then you grew up. Then you decided that perhaps it will be a good idea to go to college. And then they told you, well, if you want to go to college, this is the courses you have to take. And then that brought you to this class. So we're all sitting here now because of this. But that's where it started. And that question has no answer, does it? It has absolutely no answer. Like, we have no idea. It's almost like somebody took you and threw you in here, and you're like, whoa, what's going on? So that is the point there, right? This is the most important question here, is the one we usually don't even ask, because we know there's no answer to that. But it is the most important question. In a matter of fact, this is the fundamental question of philosophy, because that's what philosophy studies. What is going on? What is happening? I'm waking up every day, going to work, eating dinner, going to bed. Why? What? Why am I not a rock or something? I could have been a rock or a dog. I'm not. Is there a point to that, or is it just some random? But it seems strange for it to be random. I mean, there is a reason why I'm this person and not some other person, right? And each one of us kind of think in this way. It seems like it could be completely for no reason whatsoever. We just don't know the reason. But it seems like there could be a reason. Remember, Plato was trying to answer it and came up with this whole story about the afterlife and how they offer you different lives there and you decide which one to pick. Well, it may be a pure speculation, but it's an attempt to answer this question. And it seems like there should have been some kind of an answer. Okay, so back to Schopenhauer. Well, the will, according to Schopenhauer, actually gives us a glimpse at this whole thing. For many reasons. The body is objectified will. Will that has become a representation. But on one hand, like we are already the will, but we are still already the body, but we are still the will. And we can kind of feel it in what? It's driving us. Do you feel something is driving you? Do you? Yeah. It doesn't even seem like you're doing it yourself. It seems like something is driving you. So, the thing in itself, that is what it is. That's that thing which is driving all of us. The will is the innermost, the kernel of every individual thing, and likewise of the whole. So he says that the will has different objectifications. So basically, the idea is this. You have like a pyramid, starting with inanimate objects, inorganic matter. That's already the will. The sand, the stones, the dead matter. But it's least objectified. Then, what do you think is higher than that? Plants, right? They have some sort of life, but it's not yet not the same as the living organisms. And that would be next step, like animals. And what's on the top of this pyramid? Human beings. He's saying the biggest difference is individuation. Like in terms of the animals, they have a species, and the species is more or less the same. Yes, the animal may have a little bit of the individuality, but not that much. Human beings, though, each one of us is different. We all have our own unique individuality. So this is all part of the will. The whole pyramid is the will. But in terms of how much objectification it has, the higher up you are, the more the objectification. Now, we feel pleasure and we feel pain. What do they mean? He's saying that's the will telling us something. What is the will telling you when you feel pain? Don't do it, right? The will is not happy. And that's actually literally the will telling you you should not be doing this. So like if you stick a needle in your arm, your will immediately will inform you that you should not be doing that because you will feel pain. And the harder you stick it, the more pain you will feel. On the other hand, there is pleasure. What gives you pleasure? Well, one of the most pleasurable thing is sex, right? But why? Well, the will wants you to do it. Why would the will want you to have sex? What's the point of sex? Children, yeah. To create other tiny little human beings. The more the better. So that's the idea of the will. If you interfere with it, you kind of already interfere with the will. But the will wants you to create them and then do what? Well, die, because it's no longer necessary. Right? That's the point. You give life to new generation and you go away. That's why the body self-destructs. Self-destroys. Like the body is actually, it's a scientific fact. I don't know if you guys know about it. Our DNA tells us to die. It's literally in our DNA. It's not just when we're worn out because with time, like the car, right? If you drive the car, it gets worn. No, the body self-destructs. It's literally, depending on age, it starts destroying your molecules to the point when you die. Why? Because get away. It's like time for somebody else. And that is the will. There's something is doing it. Something. To think about it, like it's not an accidental process. Something is driving this whole thing. And that is the will. That's what he says the will is. Also, he says human beings by themselves don't have any free will. We think what we do, he says that's a deception. There's no such thing. Only the will itself is free, but the will is not like each one of us is a small part of this will. Because you see, when we talk about it, it seems like the will has these grand plans, and tiny little individual is not really a big part of this plan. The will doesn't care if one person dies. It cares that the species is preserved, but not one individual. So he thinks that there's no such thing as free will at all. He says the illusion of free will is the result of our incomplete knowledge. Well, we already heard it with Spinoza, and that's the similar idea. He says, because in self-consciousness, the will is known immediately and in itself, this consciousness is also consciousness of freedom. However, this overlooks the fact that the individual, the person, is not will as a thing in itself, but rather an appearance of the will. As such, is determined and has entered into the form of appearance the principle of sufficient reason. Once you're born, you are part of this system of causes. And so, even though the will is driving you, you cannot by yourself change the pattern. However, there's like an interesting thing about it. So he says to suppose that we have freedom is like this. It is just the same as if we were to say, in the case of a vertical pole, thrown off balance and hesitating which way to fall, that it can topple over to the right or topple over to the left. This can has only a subjective significance and really means in view of the data known to us. For objectively, the direction of the fall is necessarily determined as soon as the hesitation takes place. So that's the same idea as like with flipping the coin, right? Do you know if it's going to be heads or tails? No. But is it like not following the laws of physics? Oh no, it follows the laws. Like there is a particular force we applying to this coin, which makes it turn in the air, right? And then resistance of air, and then when it hits the ground, it can all be calculated. It's just that when you flip in the coin, you don't know exactly all these laws, so you cannot calculate it yourself. But theoretically, if there was some supercomputer which would get information about the force you are flipping the coin and the direction and all this stuff, the computer would tell you exactly how it's going to fall, because there's no miracle here. It's all following laws of physics. So he says human beings are like this too. It may seem to you that you can do whatever you want, but you can't. It's actually not really up to you, because the whole thing is, remember, the fourth root is the motive. Everything has a motive. You don't do things for no reason. You do them for the reason. So we do now have a character. There is intelligible and empirical character. Intelligible character is outside of time. That's kind of this thing in itself type thing. Indivisible act of the will. That is what we are given, he thinks, at birth. Now, empirical character, on the other hand, is the development of intelligible character in time, space, and other forms of the law. This is what we actually learn about others and about ourselves. We learn what kind of character we have. In principle, a causal account can be given to explain any of individual actions. If you want to know why this person did this thing, you certainly can find out. Maybe the person doesn't want to tell you, but there is a reason, right? And it can be, in fact, pretty much calculated if you know all these details. In practice, there are too many factors and traits for us to be able to predict individual behavior. This is true of one's own character, not just other people, but even yourself. We only gradually accumulate still incomplete knowledge of our own character. That character is given to us at birth, but we don't know it yet. The result of this accumulation is an acquired character, complete knowledge of the empirical character. So there are more interesting things which he developed based on this. This is kind of the foundation. So objectification of the will. One of the most interesting things about his philosophy, he tried to actually apply it to different areas. So the natural forces is the lowest objectification, and then objectification goes all the way to the human being, which is the highest objectification. But he also uses Plato to explain it. Platonic forms. Remember Platonic forms? So he's saying that this is different forms, like the form of stone nest, the form of animal, like the dog nest, and so on. And these forms are related to the thing in itself. He kind of introduces it there. So what is the goal of the thing in itself? What is the goal of the will? He says it's completely pointless. It's blind. And that's one interesting thing. He says that it has no point. Hegel thinks that the whole thing develops to some higher level of understanding. Schopenhauer is very pessimistic about everything. He says, no, this constant striving is completely pointless. It has no goal whatsoever. It's just doing this because it's in the nature of the will. It's driving everybody. The will is aimless. It has no goal. It's blind. It's just this force. So one way now to approach it is through art, aesthetic experience. And that, he says, is probably the best way to understand the will, through art. Because in that case, we get access not to the will, but to these forms, to Platonic forms. And the forms themselves related to the will. Art allows us to do it. But even though everybody can kind of have this experience, we need an intermediary of a genius, of somebody who, an artist, somebody who actually can see that better than us. So, what exactly is aesthetic contemplation? What do you feel when you are in front of the work of art? He's saying, this is when the will stops forcing you, and you just have this pure contemplation of reality without the will interfering and forcing you to do something. And this is when you truly appreciate the reality as it is in itself. So individual cases, merely individual becomes a pure, will-less, painless, timeless subject of knowledge, which is why we admire art. He had a lot of influence on the philosophy of art. And this is kind of the starting point. Right? He's saying that when we appreciate art, we actually have this kind of will-less point of view. This is what is amazing about it. And the genius is the person who just has better grasp of it, and then this genius translated through their paintings or through their music, through their poetry, and so on. But they suffer a lot more than we do. That actually is one of the curses of the genius, because they can see a lot more than we do, and they are, to them, this is very difficult fate, being a genius, being able to see these things and transmit it. We only then get the product, right, the genius work of art, and we enjoy it. But they themselves have to kind of suffer through creation of that. The work of art, in producing the work of art, the genius makes the beautiful accessible to non-genius, to all of us. The artist replicates the object of nature in the artwork in such a manner that the viewer is capable of viewing it disinterestedly. And that's the important part, because in life, normally, we are driven by the will. The will drives us, like, when we, for example, enjoy the meal at a restaurant or look at the food, how do you think it's related to the will? The will wants us to eat, right? Because that's what we need to survive, and then have sex and do all these other will things. Obviously, that would be why we enjoy food. Similarly, things related to sex, like especially young people, they think a lot about sex. It's a big part of their life. That's all the will. It's driving you. But the art is where you kind of step away from all that. And this is neutral in a sense, because like it's not driving you anywhere. You no longer have this drive. So this is when you can truly appreciate things. He ranks the arts in the following way. So this is from bottom to top. He says on the bottom is architecture. Why? Because the ideas architecture portrays are just this idea of space, heaviness, lightness, which are most basic, like, right? On this scale, it's the inorganic matter, right? That would be like sand, rock, this stuff. So architecture is already art, but it's the lowest of the art. Slightly higher is landscape, gardening, and painting. So if you see a painting of the forest, for example, so that's already plants, right? So this is slightly higher, but it still is not that high of an art. Next, animal painting and sculpture, like all these dogs, cats, and so on, because it goes up. It's already something more sophisticated, more objectified type of will, but not the highest yet. Then poetry. Poetry is much higher, because now we are talking about human beings. Poetry are related to human feelings and human life. The higher one now is tragedy. Why? Because not only it is about humans, but it portrays life as it really is. And life as it really is tragedy. Life is tragic. And he is very pessimistic. He is a famous pessimistic philosopher. He says, well, there's no point to this whole thing. It is one suffering after another, and then when you're done with all the suffering, you die, which is the biggest suffering of all. That's the praise we get when we finally make it through all the other suffering. a tragedy really shows this to us. And for this reason, tragedy is on top of this list. But there is one genre of art he puts above all else. I don't know if you, what do you guys think it is? He's famous for this. What else is left? The paintings here, sculpture, poetry. Huh? Well, philosophy is not art. Music. Music. Music is above all else. Music is at the top of the whole thing. Music is so very much more powerful and penetrating than is that of other arts. For this only speak in shadows, but music in essence. Music is the will in itself, as it is. And that's why when we listen to the music, it touches us so much. Music is the highest of all the arts. So yeah, like I said, that is very pessimistic philosophy. He is a famous pessimist. Basically, he says that the will has no purpose. It's driving us all the time. And what the best thing we can actually do is resist it. And for this reason, he is actually, he read Indian philosophy and Vedanta. And he accepted this idea. He thought, he said that he had this idea even before them, but after he read it, he actually completely agreed with them. And what is the most fundamental in this philosophy? The detachment, right? You should not be excited by anything. You should just be like the Buddha, basically, just very calm, very peaceful. Everything will pass. Don't worry about it. So that's kind of his idea. He says the will itself is just the constant suffering. And there's nothing you can do about this suffering. But one thing you can do is don't give up to the will. The will wants you to do all these things. Don't do that. Just kind of relax. Withdraw yourself from this crazy dance of life. Contemplate. Look at art. Be peaceful and calm. And wait for your way to die. It seems like with this, maybe somebody would say, well, then why not just commit suicide? But he's saying, no. If you commit suicide, you actually then given up to the will, because you no longer resist it. So you should not commit suicide. You could continue living and suffering. Just don't do anything. Just don't fight against. Of course, one ironic thing, and many people pointed out, is that his own life was anything but this. He actually was very ambitious. He really wanted his philosophy to be accepted. He enjoyed good meals. He had multiple affairs with women. So like, whatever he practiced, it was opposite to his philosophy. Well, I guess if we actually asked him, he would probably say, well, I'm weak. I know this is the best way to live, but I just can't do it. Because remember that in Philosophy 101, we were talking about that. That's a type of ad hominem, right? It's a tu quoque ad hominem. Just because he himself didn't do it doesn't mean that his arguments should not be accepted. Yes, perhaps he himself can't resist the will either. He is too weak to resist it. But if you can, you should try. You should do your best. So anyway, that's part of his ethics. He says all life is suffering. Genius suffers most of all. I guess he would say that he was genius, so he was suffering too most of all. But just try your best to suffer through until the very end, and then you will die. And that's pretty much all there is to life. It's an interesting viewpoint at the whole thing, because it's very pessimistic, right? With Hegel, the spirit is developing towards something better. And Marx agreed with that in a sense that not the spirit, but the human beings do move towards communism. But Schopenhauer now says, no, there's nothing. There's no point to any of this stuff. It's just suffering, and then you'll die. So what should we do? And then, of course, she says the biggest enemy is boredom. So that kind of slowly brings us towards when we're going to next week talk about Kierkegaard and existentialism, because they were influenced. Kierkegaard read Schopenhauer, agreed with him. Nietzsche actually was so impressed by Schopenhauer, and we'll talk week after the next about Nietzsche, that at first he read the World and Will as representation several times and absolutely loved it. And then he started criticizing some stuff. But they both start with Schopenhauer. So boredom is one of those problems we have in life. Life swings like a pendulum to and fro between pain and boredom, and these two are in fact the ultimate constituents. So if you're not in pain, you are bored. And then if you're not bored, you are in pain. That happens all the time until finally you die. Purely intellectual pleasures are inaccessible to the vast majority of people. Most people are almost entirely incapable of experiencing the joy that lies in pure cognition. They are completely given over to the willing. Right? Because most people, like the entertainment they have is related to either sex or food, or some combination of the two. So if anything is to gain their sympathy and interest them, it must, and this is already clear from the meaning of the word, somehow arouse their will, even if in relation to the will is distant and merely theoretical.